The storm was coming fast, and Alex Chen knew he had only hours before the hurricane made landfall. At 24, he'd weathered plenty of coastal storms, but this one felt different, more personal, more urgent. The old warehouse behind his childhood home had been leaking for months, and his father, David, had finally asked him to clear out the stored boxes before the rain destroyed everything. Alex pulled on his work gloves and stepped into the musty building, flashlight in hand. The smell of aged wood and forgotten memories filled his nostrils as he began sorting through decades of accumulated belongings. His father, now 60 and retired from his job at the shipping company, had always been secretive about his past. Even his mother, Sarah, 58 and still working as a school librarian, seemed to know remarkably little about David's life before they met 30 years ago. Thunder rumbled overhead as Alex lifted a heavy cardboard box labeled 1994 in his father's careful handwriting. The box felt heavier than it should have, and when he set it down, the bottom gave way, spilling its contents across the concrete floor. Among the scattered papers and photographs, one item caught his attention, a yellowed envelope with no return address, postmarked from Chicago. Alex's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in rushed, panicked handwriting. To David, they know you saw what happened at the warehouse. Marcus is dead and they think you might talk. Get out of Chicago now. Take your family and disappear. Don't contact anyone from the old crew. They're watching everyone. This is your only warning, Jay. Alex felt his blood turn to ice. The letter was dated just 2 months before his parents had suddenly moved from Chicago to this small coastal town. He'd been too young to question the abrupt relocation. But now, reading these words, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. The warehouse door creaked behind him, and Alex spun around his heart, hammering against his ribs. His father stood in the doorway, his weathered face pale in the flashlight beam. "Dad," Alex said, his voice barely steady. "What is this?" David's shoulders sagged as he stepped into the warehouse. At 60, he still carried himself with the careful posture of someone always watching for danger, though Alex had never understood why until now. "I hoped you'd never find that." "Find what? A death threat?" Alex's voice cracked with emotion. "Dad, who wanted to kill you? Who's Marcus? What warehouse?" David closed the warehouse door behind him, his movements deliberate and cautious. "Son, there are things about my past that I've kept hidden to protect you and your mother. Things that could still put us all in danger." "What kind of things?" Alex pressed, clutching the letter tighter. His father was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter in Alex's hands. "I witnessed something terrible in Chicago. Something that got a good man killed." Before Alex could ask more questions, his father turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him alone with his racing thoughts and a dozen new questions. The storm was getting closer, but Alex knew the real tempest was just beginning. The next morning, Alex confronted his mother in the kitchen over coffee. Sarah had always been the more talkative parent, but when he showed her the letter, she went completely silent. "Mom, please," Alex said, studying her face as she reread the threatening words. "I need to know what happened." Sarah set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. "Your father made me promise never to discuss Chicago. He said it was the only way to keep us safe." "Safe from what?" "From people who don't forgive and don't forget." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Alex, your father isn't a criminal. He's a good man who saw something he shouldn't have seen." That afternoon, Alex made a decision that would change everything. Despite his father's obvious reluctance to discuss the past, Alex couldn't let the mystery rest. He was an engineer by training, methodical and logical in his approach to problems. This was just another puzzle to solve, albeit one with potentially deadly consequences. He drove to the local library where his mother worked and used the internet to research Chicago crime from the early 1990s. What he found made his stomach turn. Marcus Rodriguez had been found dead in a warehouse on the south side of Chicago in 1994, apparently killed during a robbery gone wrong. The case had never been solved, but several witnesses had been questioned and later disappeared or moved away suddenly. That evening, Alex waited until his parents were asleep before calling the Chicago Police Department. The desk sergeant was helpful, but not encouraging. "The Rodriguez case is still technically open," the officer explained. "But it's been cold for decades. Most of the original investigators have retired or passed away." "What about witnesses?" Alex asked. "There was one witness who gave a statement and then vanished. Never testified at trial because there was no trial. No arrests were ever made." Alex's heart pounded as he realized the witness had probably been his father. 3 days later, Alex made another discovery that sent his investigation in a completely new direction. While helping his mother organize files at the library, he found a note stuck between the pages of an old phone book. It was written in his father's handwriting. "Harris knows the truth. Coffee shop on Pine Street. If anything happens to me, trust him." Alex had never heard his father mention anyone named Harris, but the note was clearly meant as some kind of insurance policy. The coffee shop on Pine Street was only a few blocks from the library, and after some internal debate, Alex decided to investigate. The shop was small and cluttered, filled with local retirees reading newspapers and playing chess. Alex approached the counter and asked if anyone knew a man named Harris. "That'd be me," said a gravelly voice from a corner booth. "You must be David's boy." Alex turned to see a man in his 70s with intelligent eyes and calloused hands. "How did you know? You look just like your father did at your age. Plus, he said you might come looking for me someday." Harris gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down, son. We have a lot to discuss." Over the next hour, Harris told Alex a story that made him question everything he thought he knew about his father. Harris had worked with David at a shipping company in Chicago, but their real connection went deeper than just being co-workers. "Your father saved my life," Harris said, stirring his coffee slowly. "We were working late at the warehouse when we heard shouting. There was a meeting happening in the back office, men in expensive suits talking about moving merchandise that definitely wasn't legal." "What kind of merchandise?" "Drugs, weapons, money from various illegal enterprises." Harris leaned forward. "Your father wanted to leave, but I was curious. We hid behind some shipping containers and watched." Alex felt his pulse quicken. "What did you see?" "We saw Marcus Rodriguez get executed because he tried to back out of the operation. Shot twice in the head by a man named Vincent Torino." The name sent a chill through Alex. Even someone his age had heard of Vincent Torino, a Chicago crime boss whose organization had been virtually untouchable for decades. "Dad witnessed a murder." Alex said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "Not just witnessed it, recorded it." Harris pulled out a small cassette recorder. "Your father was always paranoid about workplace disputes, so he carried this little device to record conversations. That night, it captured everything." Alex stared at the recorder in disbelief. "He has evidence," had evidence. He turned it over to the FBI, but before they could act, Torino's people found out about the recording. "They killed Marcus to keep him quiet, and they were planning to kill your father too. But Dad escaped. More than that, he made a deal with the FBI. They relocated your family in exchange for his testimony whenever they could build a case strong enough to take down Torino." Alex felt the world spinning around him. "So, we're in witness protection. Unofficial witness protection. Your father never testified because Torino's lawyers always managed to get the case dismissed or delayed. But the threat never went away." That night, Alex couldn't sleep. Every sound outside his window seemed threatening, every shadow potentially dangerous. He understood now why his father had always been so careful, why they'd moved to such a remote coastal town, why David rarely talked about his past. But understanding didn't make the danger any less real. The next morning, Alex made a decision that would test everything Harris had told him. He drove to the county courthouse and researched property records looking for any connection between their small town and Chicago criminal organizations. What he found made his blood run cold. Vincent Torino had purchased a beach house just 10 miles from their town only 6 months ago. Alex's hands shook as he printed out the property records. Torino wasn't just a distant threat from the past, he was practically their neighbor. The timing couldn't be coincidental. He raced home to find his father working in the garden, apparently unconcerned about the danger that might be closing in around them. But when Alex showed him the property records, David's face went white. "He's found us," David said, his voice hollow. "How is that possible?" "I don't know. We were so careful." David stood up slowly, his movements suddenly those of a much older man. "Alex, you need to take your mother and leave town. Tonight." "I'm not leaving you." "This isn't a discussion. Torino doesn't make empty threats. If he's here, it's because he plans to finish what he started 30 years ago." But Alex was already thinking like the engineer he'd trained to be, analyzing the problem from every angle. "Dad, what if we don't run? What if we finally end this?" "How?" "By giving the FBI what they need to put Torino away for good." David shook his head. "Son, I turned over the only evidence I had decades ago. The recording is long gone, probably destroyed. But you're still alive. You can still testify. My testimony alone won't be enough, not after all these years." Alex spent the rest of the day researching federal witness protection procedures and cold case investigations. By evening, he had a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. "We're going to Chicago," he told his parents over dinner. "Absolutely not," Sarah said immediately. "Mom, listen. Harris still has connections with the FBI. If we can get Dad to Chicago safely, he can finally give his testimony. With Torino operating so close to us, they'll have to take the threat seriously." David was quiet for a long moment. "Even if they believe us, even if they reopen the case, Torino's people will try to stop us before we reach Chicago. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are." That night, Alex lay in bed reviewing his plan. They would leave at dawn, taking back roads to avoid highways where Torino's people might be watching. Harris would meet them halfway and escort them to the FBI field office in Chicago. It was risky, but staying in town was even more dangerous. What Alex didn't know was that Vincent Torino was already 3 steps ahead of them. At 3 a.m., Alex woke to the sound of car engines outside their house. He crept to the window and saw 3 black sedans parked in their driveway, men in dark suits standing beside them. His heart hammered as he realized they were trapped. Moving as quietly as possible, Alex woke his parents and whispered his discovery. David's face was grim, but not surprised. "There's a service tunnel under the house," he said. "It leads to the storm drain system. We can escape that way." "You've been planning for this," Alex realized. "For 30 years. They gathered only essential items and made their way to the basement. David moved aside a heavy workbench to reveal a hidden trapdoor. Below was a narrow tunnel that smelled of damp earth and decades of fear. "This leads to the main drain pipe," David explained as they crawled through the tight space. "From there we can reach the old pier." The tunnel was claustrophobic and terrifying, but Alex focused on moving forward. Behind them, he could hear muffled voices and the sound of their front door being kicked in. They emerged from the storm drain near the waterfront, soaked and shaking. In the distance, Alex could see lights moving through their house as Torino's men searched for them. "Then Harris has a boat," David said. "If we can reach the marina, we can get to the mainland." But as they moved through the shadows toward the pier, Alex spotted more men positioned around the marina. Torino had anticipated their escape route. "We're surrounded," he whispered. That's when Alex heard the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, his mother's sharp intake of breath as a flashlight beam found them. "There they are," a voice called out. Suddenly, the night exploded with activity. Men emerged from behind boats and buildings, all moving toward their position. Alex grabbed his parents' hands and ran. They sprinted along the waterfront, jumping over ropes and dodging around fishing equipment. Behind them, footsteps pounded on the wooden pier, and Alex could hear shouted orders. "The bridge," David gasped, pointing toward the causeway that connected their island to the mainland. They ran harder than Alex had ever run in his life. His lungs burned and his legs felt like lead, but he could hear the pursuers getting closer. A gunshot echoed across the water, then another. "They're shooting at us," Sarah cried. "Keep running," David shouted back. They reached the bridge, just as a car screeched to a halt in front of them. Alex's heart sank, thinking they'd been caught, but then he saw Harris behind the wheel. "Get in," the old man yelled. They dove into the car as more gunshots rang out. Harris floored the accelerator, and they sped across the bridge with Torino's men in pursuit. "How did you know?" Alex asked, gasping for breath. "Your father called me before you left the house. I've been watching Torino's people for weeks." The chase continued for miles, with Harris taking sharp turns and using his knowledge of local roads to stay ahead of their pursuers. Alex watched through the rear window as muzzle flashes lit up the night behind them. "They're gaining on us," he said. "Not for long," Harris replied, turning onto a dirt road that led into dense forest. The old man drove with the confidence of someone who'd planned this route many times. They bounced and jolted through the wood's branches, scraping against the windows, until they finally reached a small clearing where another car was waiting. "FBI," Harris explained as two agents in bulletproof vests approached their vehicle. The next few hours passed in a blur of debriefings and preparation. The FBI agents, led by a woman named Special Agent Rivera, listened carefully to David's story and examined the evidence Harris had preserved. "We've been trying to build a case against Torino for decades," Rivera explained. "Your father's testimony combined with the physical evidence and Torino's recent activities should be enough to finally put him away." "What about the men who chased us?" Alex asked. "They're being rounded up as we speak. Torino made a mistake by coming after you so aggressively. It gave us the excuse we needed to move against his entire organization." 3 days later, Alex sat in a federal courthouse in Chicago, watching his father testify against Vincent Torino. David's voice was steady and clear as he described the murder he'd witnessed 30 years ago, the threats that had followed, and the decades of living in fear. Torino sat at the defendant's table, his cold eyes never leaving David's face. But for the first time in Alex's life, his father didn't look away. "Mr. Chen," the prosecutor said, "can you identify the man who murdered Marcus Rodriguez?" David stood up slowly and pointed directly at Torino. "That's him. Vincent Torino. I watched him shoot Marcus Rodriguez twice in the head on March 15, 1994. The courtroom was silent as the weight of those words settled over everyone present. Alex felt tears streaming down his face as he realized his father was finally free to tell the truth. The trial lasted 2 more days. Harris testified about the recording and the evidence they'd preserved. FBI agents testified about the recent threats and the chase through the coastal town. By the end, even Torino's expensive lawyers couldn't create reasonable doubt. Vincent Torino was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. 6 of his associates, including the men who had chased Alex and his parents, received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. As they left the courthouse, Alex put his arm around his father's shoulders. "It's over," he said. "Yes," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It's finally over." They stood on the courthouse steps, a family reunited, not just with each other, but with the truth. Sarah was crying, but they were tears of relief rather than fear. For the first time in 30 years, they could live without looking over their shoulders. "What happens now?" Alex asked. "Now we go home," David said. "Our real home. Not the place where we hid, but the place where we choose to live." 6 months later, Alex was back in his workshop, but this time he was building something new, a bookshelf for his father's study. David had decided to write a memoir about his experiences, partly as therapy, and partly to help other people who might find themselves in similar situations. The truth doesn't always set you free immediately. David had written in his first chapter, "Sometimes it takes 30 years and the courage of your children to finally break the chains of the past." Alex smiled as he read those words. His father had taught him that some secrets are worth keeping, but others are meant to be exposed. The difference is knowing which is which and having the courage to act when the time comes. The workshop where Alex now worked was filled with natural light and the smell of fresh wood shavings. Unlike the musty warehouse where this all began, this space felt hopeful and forward-looking. On his workbench sat a framed photo of his family taken after the trial. 3 people who had survived the storm and emerged stronger. As Alex put the finishing touches on the bookshelf, he thought about the lessons he'd learned. Sometimes the people we trust most are carrying burdens we can't imagine. Sometimes justice takes decades to arrive, but it's worth waiting for. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is stand up for the truth, even when it's dangerous. The bookshelf was beautiful solid oak with clean lines and careful joinery. But more than that, it was a symbol of something permanent, something that would last. Like the truth his father had finally been able to tell, like the justice that had finally been served, like the family that had finally been set free. Outside, the sun was setting over the water, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. But for the first time in his life, Alex wasn't worried about what tomorrow might bring. The storm had passed, and they had weathered it together. The truth, as his father had always known, was worth any price they'd had to pay.